going to shift quickly to looking at podcasting on the audio format with Heneka Watkis Porter. Now, Heneka and I have a long history. And when it comes down to podcasting in the Caribbean, Heneka has probably one of the longest running and most successful business podcasts. So she definitely knows the answer to every question that you might have about podcasting. Heneka is an entrepreneur, a business coach, an author, and I would dare say a good friend of mine. And I enjoy not only talking to Heneka about business, but just generally. And I'm sure you will sense her spirit and her vibe in her presentation. So I'm looking forward to this presentation. Heneka is the CEO of Pato Apparel as well, one of the Caribbean's premier fashion brand. She has worked on conferences. She has spoken at different conferences all over the world. She has interviewed everybody from Seth Godin to myself, to many other owners, influencers, marketers, business people, and she's going to help us dissect what is important for podcasting. Do we have any on?
Yes, I am right here.
Hi, Heneka, how are you?
Hi, I am great. Thank you very much. After all of that setup, I gotta deliver, right?
Yes, absolutely. Welcome to Digital Housing again. This is your second Digital Housing. I'm looking forward to your presentation. Over to you.
Okay, awesome sauce. Thank you so much, Javed, and big up to all the presenters. Big up to yourself, Brian. Great presentation that you delivered earlier. All right, so I'm talking about podcasting and the audio format, all in the light of podcasting for good, business for good, marketing for good, digital for good, right? And as Javed says, yes, I have been doing podcasting since 2017. Actually had it, the Entrepreneur Review as a radio show. That's how it started. Mm-hmm. And then eventually I decided, you know what, I want to reach a bigger audience. So podcasting it is, and I have been podcasting ever since. All right, so you know my name already. And you've heard a little bit about me, that I've been interviewing these amazing folks. I'm an author, etc. So I won't spend a lot of time there. I just want to head quickly into the history of audio. And then we talk about podcasting and podcasting for good. So we've seen that over the past, several years, that we can see audio being broken down into 4 different eras, right? So we have the acoustic era, running from 1877 to 1925, the electric era 1925 to 1945, the magnetic era 1945 to 75, and of course digital era that we're now in from 1975 to current. So audio has come a long way, and it ain't going anywhere. Audio is one of the most intimate forms of connecting with an audience. And so, I'd be happy even if we had to do just audio for this, I'd be fine. All right, so let's move into what really is a podcast. Now, I hear a lot, and I'm not going to take it for granted that we all know what a podcast is, because I still get the question asked a lot. So I think it's important that I spend a little time to explain what it is in a nutshell. So really what it is an audio format, audio file that's available for download or streaming via the internet. It has to be available via RSS feed, and don't be too put off by that term, that technical term. It's not so technical. When you think about, say, for example, you go on somebody's website and you are able to see their Twitter feed or their Instagram feed, you're actually seeing that via RSS. So that's what it is. And I have a little pet peeve, because I see persons doing their Facebook lives, their Instagram lives, etc., and even their YouTube channel, and they keep calling it a podcast. And when you go on different podcast players, it's nowhere to be found, right? So it's not a podcast if it doesn't have that on demand, because what makes it stand out more than anything else is that it's on demand. You can listen to it whenever you want to, you miss an episode, you can download it for future listening, or you don't have to, like a radio show, for example, when you miss an episode, you miss it for life. It doesn't work like that. So of course, it can be accessed by your iPhone, your Android, your tablet, whatever it is, and you can receive subscribers automatically. Your subscribers, your listeners, you can receive those automatically. So, and I like to say, think about online radio, except that it's more than that. It has a lot of evergreen capabilities. So you don't have to worry, as I mentioned earlier, that you would miss an episode, because it's always there, it's always relevant. Unless the podcaster takes down that episode, it's there permanently. You can always listen whenever you want to. So how did podcasting come about, really? So it came about as a result of a conversation that was had between two gentlemen, Adam Curry and Dave Weiner. That happened in 2004. And since then, shortly after that, in 2005, it's when iTunes, which it's now Apple Podcasts, as you probably are aware, Apple Podcasts decided that they're going to take it on, and so now they are the creme de la creme of podcast directories. Now, wherever you host a podcast, where you can access it from, that's called a directory. So there are myriad of directories. There's Apple, there's Google, Stitcher, Blueberry, Podbean, Anchor, etc., etc. The list goes on and on. And when you look at the stats of podcasting, which I'm going to get into a little from this, when you look at the stats, it's growing year on year. So it ain't going anywhere. And we're talking about, purpose, marketing for purpose and for good and all these things. And I always say that your voice, you have a voice, your purpose, and it's that power that you have within you is voice activated. And when you can use your voice to spread a message, spread a yard and abroad, as I like to say, then you are doing something great. And don't you ever think that you don't have anything to say, because we all have something to say. We all have power within us. And again, that power is voice activated. And let me pause here to say, it's by no accident why I'm presenting today. I think it's book up. It's not a book up. It's divine intervention, I would say, because guess what day today is? It's International Podcast Day. Yeah, September 30 every year is recognized as International Podcast Day. So I'm really excited to be talking about what for the last couple of years has given me life, and has taken me through some really difficult times as well. So yeah, big up to podcasting. And if you're in podcasting yet, you need to start. We can talk further. So podcasts have several different uses, of course, to educate the entrepreneurial you, which we mentioned earlier, which is my podcast. And I also do podcasts for the Jamaica Stock Exchange, which is called Jamaica Stock Exchange and You, as well as Eggs and Banks podcast, Your Business Matters. And those podcasts, they educate, right? So they educate regarding entrepreneurship and business issues. Then there are podcasts that will entertain, like The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. You should check that out. Really, really fun podcast. And podcasts that inform. And of course, there's overlap. I'm not going to say there isn't an overlap amongst all these different categories, because a podcast can also educate, entertain, and do all at the same time. How I built this with Guy Raz is actually one that I'd say is very informative. Right? It talks about talking to all these entrepreneurs, going through the various elements of how they did what they, how they built what they have now. Very excellent podcast, I might add. And the good thing about podcasts is that it forces us to become better listeners. We're talking about, doing things for good. It forces us to become better listeners. You're more engaged because you don't have the visuals to go along with what it is that you are communicating to an audience. So as a result of that, you have to be intentional, to be very clear. If you are talking about something that would require, to highlight the senses, the visual, the sight of someone, then being able to describe, being able to even the sights, the sounds and smells and other things that the visuals will do, but an audio won't be able to do. So it forces you to become more, become better listeners, and really more personable, more personal, because you're actually in the ear of your audience members. You're actually forcing them to, but not forcing them, they're actually doing it by choice, but they are able to listening on their own time. They're choosing to do that. You're forming a connection, you're forming a bond with your audience. And again, we talk about that. We talk about the fact that it's on demand and it's easy to access. You can download it when you have Wi-Fi and listen to it at some other point if you're out of Wi-Fi zone, things like that. Now, I want to spend a little time talking about the podcast listener. The podcast listener predominantly, based on stats, white male, highly educated, degreed, and income. I should have mentioned income right there instead of degree, because educated and degree, same thing. That's what I wanted to say. But their income potential is higher than average. So I'm saying all of this to say that as marketers, there is an opportunity for us to target, to be specifically targeting various audiences, various groups, various target audience for our products and services. Now we know exactly who is listening to a podcast. Now, with my being in the Caribbean leading, I would like to say one of the leaders in the podcasting industry. Of course, the game is changing. We're seeing a lot of Caribbean people take on the podcasting journey, being on the podcasting journey, and it's such a rewarding experience. There's also the fact that studies show that persons who listen or come to know about a brand as a result of a podcast versus, say, on Facebook or Instagram, the trust level of hearing it on a podcast is much higher than it would were they learning about that brand somewhere else. And the connection that they have with the host, the trust level and all of that, makes conversion easier than any other platform, according to research. Now, as of 2 days ago, you can have a look at the screen according to podcastindex.org. 2 days ago, we're seeing a total of close to 4.3 million podcasts available. Now, this is the entire gamut of all these directories. So we're talking about Apple, Google, all of these combined. And look at the smaller numbers, they're drilling down into the numbers. So over the last 3 days, we'll say 5 days, the number perhaps changed a little because I would have done this about 2 days ago. Over the last 3 days, 110, 371 epic shows have been published, right? So look at that, let that sink in for a while. And then I want to share what's going on with Apple. Now, Apple accounts for just under, it's decreasing because generally it's about 70%, but it fluctuates between 50 and 70% in terms of where persons access their podcast, because Stitcher is coming up very, very close. And so we have to pay attention to Stitcher. But predominantly, we're seeing of the 4.3 million podcasts that are available, close to 2.4 million of those are in Apple alone, right? With just about 250,000 active podcasts, right? So we're coming from 4.3. And if we double this, because we're thinking this is about 50% of the total, we're looking at about 500,000 episodes that are uploaded every, with 10 episodes or more over the last 90 days. Why is this important? Because this is showing the real active podcast. So as a podcast evangelist, it's important to say that podcasting are growing, the industry is growing and persons are learning more about podcasts, particularly last year within the pandemic, when the pandemic really started, we had so many persons starting podcasts. But here's the thing, there's a thing that's called pod fade, and pod fade is so real. Pod fade is real because persons, you get excited, yeah, I'm going to start a podcast, because never before has it been as easy as it is right now to start a podcast. And so because it's so easy, you put no effort into it, and you're excited though, you start your first episode, and you perhaps go to episode number 3, and before you know it, there is nothing there after that. Like, no. As a podcast evangelist, that's another pet peeve I have. It requires stick-to-itiveness. It requires a dedication. It requires consistency, because there are times when you don't feel like you're going to want to do a podcast, but yet you have an audience that is looking for you, looking for your content, and you're disappointing them. So you want to make sure that you're sticking to what you have committed to do, right? And this is American stats. This came from 2017, and I chose to go a little further back because current data can be skewed just because you have the pandemic putting a surge, and there's a lot of pod fade. So I thought it prudent to go a little back. So 50% of all homes are podcast fans. Now, this again is US stats, but it can be extrapolated to our Caribbean context, right? Because we're mirroring what is happening up north. And interestingly, and not surprisingly, is that smartphone usage is what is driving podcast listenership and podcast creation. So both the creators and the listeners themselves, with the access, the ease of access to smartphone devices, is driving it. So be very aware that you have a tool in your hand that you can use for good, that you can use to spread your voice, that you can use to spread your message wherever you are. And it's easy as 1, 2, 3. Now, I love to talk about how to leverage your podcast to build your brand. And this is where I'm going to spend the last few minutes that I have here to talk about, because I'm well aware that we are behind in terms of scheduling, and I don't want to infringe on anybody else's time. So podcast power. Well, before I go to podcast power, this is how I have been using the podcast to leverage my brand. I talk about the fact that I would have started my podcast in 2017, having started the actual radio show on Power 106, and that went on for 3 seasons in 2014 up to 2016. And I have been doing all of these that you see I have here on my screen: public speaking, press pass, coaching programs, partnership, using my expertise to write, connect, and host events, right? So let's talk about the public speaking. Now, sometimes we think that, we will never get accepted for a conference, we never get to speak if we pitch, but all we have to do is just go right out and make that ask. Pitch yourself in the best way you know how, right? I have been able to speak at some of the largest conferences, not just in Jamaica, but overseas as well. Last year, I spoke back-to-back at 3 different conferences in the US. 2 of them were I spoke all about podcasting, and 2 of them were podcast conference, and this one was technology, ATD technology. Now, this is one of the largest conferences in tech there is. So speaking about podcasting, now, whatever it is you want to communicate, whatever message that you want to communicate, you can use your podcast as a platform to do that. And the fact that you're a podcast host, that also gives you some credibility and leverage that you can use and share. It opens the door for you to accept invite to speak. Now, initially, you may choose to, speak at some event and say, all right, I'm going to speak at these events without being paid because I want the experience. And as you go along, then you can demand your fees, right? You can demand your fees to speak because they're actually sharing value, and you should be sharing value with an audience. So one of the things I talk a lot about is actually how to start a podcast in 1 day, right? It's one of my favorite topics. Persons love it. They always give me great feedback about the fact that they are able to start a podcast in a day, right? But that's not what I'm talking about today. I'm just talking about generally what it can do for you. Another thing is to use your podcast as a press pass. And that is what I have done. And quick story, these are 2 conferences that I've actually used it as a press pass for. I just reach out to the organizers. Hey, I have this podcast. I'd like to attend your event. I don't pay, but you, I give you a write-up and so on. So it's a trade-off. And when I attended T-Tech conference in, when was it? Was it last year or the year before? I think it was the year before, in 2019. I met someone. I was there, you know, I used the podcast as a press pass. I was there meeting somebody who works in the cybercrime department. I met him, wanted to invite him to an event, which I'll talk about later, that I was hosting here. And so I took his number. Shortly thereafter, my phone was stolen. I was in the middle of traffic somewhere in Happitree, somewhere there, and somebody just grabbed my phone from my hand. So of course, when I went to do the report and all of that, they were taking me all around circles and whatever I need to do and traumatizing me all over again. And then I remember that I had met this person at Cybercrime from Cybercrime Division. And I thought, if anybody can help to expedite, it is somebody who works in the Cybercrime Division. So I had all my, I had my tracking number, I had everything. And I was able to reach out to him and say, hey, this is my phone that was stolen, work on it. And of course it took 4 months, but I was able to get back my phone. And I thought that was a big win because I refused to give up, because I had all the details that would make it traceable. And so, side story, a podcast can help you to get back your phone. Yay. All right, so another way in which I've been using the podcast, one of the powerful ways in which I've been using the podcast is to create coaching programs to help my audience. I do a lot of mastermind. I normally call it the 90-day goal accelerator mastermind, where we just take persons through, I take persons through their goals and objectives for a particular period and help them to accelerate that. Of course, the support that they get from the other members that are in the mastermind, you know, none of us is as smart as all of us. So from that perspective, it helps and everybody wins. And another interesting area that I've been using my podcast is for partnerships. Now, I don't know how much you know about LeaderCast, but LeaderCast is the largest one-day leadership event globally. It's an event that happens in the US. It's hosted in Atlanta, Georgia, and then it's streamed across the world. So places like Africa, Canada, of course, the Caribbean, because I've been hosting in Jamaica since 2018. Of course, for this year, I put a pause on it because of the pandemic, but it was the podcast that I was able to leverage and use that, you know, sharing and showing how it is I'm connecting with these amazing folks like Seth Godin, you know, Javed would have mentioned, Lisa Nichols, etc. And based on what I was doing, then there was alignment, right? And they thought it would be fitting. So I would host the LeaderCast Women event, which was solely based on women. You've had speakers in the past like Condoleezza Rice, some very, you know, lovely Ajayi, so many amazing women, right? And then there's LeaderCast, generally where speakers from all over, you know, men and women, Magic Johnson, Steve Wozniak, and a host of others that have graced that stage. So these are just some powerful ways that I've been using my podcast. And again, finally, well, not again, but finally, I want to talk about expertise, like sharing my expertise. So with the podcast, I've also been able to write for publications like Thrive Global and LeaderCast as well. The expertise, you know, connecting with all these persons, because you're the average of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. So in a nutshell, and writing, yes, published podcast for the Quick Start Guide to Launching and Leveling Up Your Brand. So that's it. That's how I've been using my podcast for good, for spreading the message of entrepreneurship. And if I didn't say the thing that you wanted to hear, there's time now for question and answer. So go right ahead. Thank you so much for the time.
Hi, Heneka. Thank you for that insightful presentation. I have a few questions, and I have learned a lot about how to, one, what's the distinction, but also how to leverage that to amplify your messaging. How would you advise corporates who are thinking about a podcast to go about it? Because I know you have done a lot of work with Exim Bank, and with other corporates that are looking at launching their own podcast? What are the 1, 2, 3 things that they should be doing and thinking about if they're looking to launch their own podcast?
All right, great question. I am very big on branded podcasts, and what it really is just, brands deciding to start their own podcast, not necessarily selling, because selling doesn't necessarily work well in the traditional sense, right? So provide content that your community wants to consume. What is your pain point? What are they struggling with? And once you answer that question, respond to what they're struggling with and provide that solution, then I would say you have a winner. Now, I would also say that as corporate, keep your main thing the main thing. Don't try to be all things to all people. Don't necessarily get yourself caught up with trying to run your podcast yourself, right? Let the experts do it, outsource it, or if you have somebody dedicated internally to do it. But because what will happen is that you are going to pod fade. I've learned about even big companies here in Jamaica starting podcasts, and then before you know it, there is nothing. You want to think carefully about it. You want to approach it like, let's say you're having a TV program or a radio show, with that same seriousness that you would approach it. You wouldn't start a show or a series and you have 1 show or 2 show and your audience keep coming back and they're disappointed every time. So what I'd love for persons to think about is, once you decided that you're going to have a podcast, 1, outsource it to the expert, or have someone, a team dedicated in-house to do it, not just somebody who has been doing everything else, because that will take away from the focus. But also just to understand that you need to treat it with seriousness, with all seriousness of heart, be consistent with what you're delivering. Even when I coach persons to podcast, I give the example every time that you would not want, how disappointing you would be if you go tune into RGR at 9 a.m. for your favorite show, and on Mondays, and sometimes you find that it comes on Fridays or at 11, or you want to keep that consistency, because consistency is the way to win.
Thank you, Heneka. My final question is around individuals or entrepreneurs who are trying to monetize their podcast. You hear that if you start a hit YouTube channel or a podcast, you can make lots of money. Is that the case, and how do they go about doing that?
All right, so you see, I'm getting excited to talk about the money. Show me the money, right? So like Khalil. But yeah, it's all about the money. And so from day one, I have been monetizing my podcast in various ways. 1, through direct sponsorship. So from the get-go, one of my my very dedicated and committed partner has been the Jamaica Stock Exchange through direct sponsorship. But there's also things that I've been doing. So all of those things that I talk about podcasts for, the quick start guide to launching and leveling up your brand, those are some of the things that I've been doing. So coaching is one, is as a result of the podcast. Partnering with companies like, big brands like LeaderCast, hosting workshop. I have been using affiliate marketing as another tool. Writing the book itself, writing about the podcast. So those are the ways that I have been personally monetizing. And, for me, it works. I know that I've heard persons struggle, say that they have a struggle. They can't seem to get a podcast sponsor. They can't seem to monetize. How I would advise is simply this. Don't look at, oh my gosh, I need to get 5 sponsors all at once. I want you to start with your lowest hanging fruit. So whomever you have that closest relationship with, right? Develop on that, build that, that relationship even more, and show them what it is, the value. Like everybody's tuned into WIIFM. What's in it for me? So what value are you going to be bringing to your sponsors? Show them that. For that one person, find out one sponsor and then build on that. Then you can show others, hey, this brand is sponsoring my podcast. How about you? And you can go on that.
Very, very, very strong points, Heneka. Thank you so much. I have learned a lot, and I've listened to your podcast. I've been on your podcast, and I really think it's one of those formats that if you're a marketer, you really should be thinking about how are we using audio and how can we develop the use of audio. So thank you so much, Heneka. Really good presentation. Learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience has as well.